Welcome to Mindfulness of Doom, a weekly podcast about life, peaceful living, and existential dread. You're not lost. Everyone's faking it, and the purpose of life is, enjoy the show.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 6 of the Mindfulness of Doom podcast. Corey and Brian here, and we have a couple of special guests on the show whom we'll introduce in just a few minutes. But before we get started, Corey, where's your head at?
I've been thinking a lot about death lately.
This does not surprise me.
No, not at all. Not on this podcast. But
yeah.
Lately there was an episode of CGP Grey on YouTube where he talked about medical science advancing to the point where we can prevent death. And that's what he is wanting us to do. And as a mindfulness teacher and as someone who has spent his life studying Buddhism and studying overcoming this fear of death, it kind of irked me a little bit. But the thing I wanted to bring up about it is he did a 24-hour live stream where he animated the average deaths per second for the entire planet and had it go for 24 hours. So anytime you clocked in, you could see, 30,000 people have died today. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's very dark, and also a really wonderful reminder of the mortality that we carry with us as human beings on this planet. What do you see to be the benefits of having this awareness?
The first benefit is that it brings you closer to home and reminds you that existential dread is something that we can all encounter on our daily lives.
Yeah,
but
we're certainly not alone.
It's the idea, again, like we talked about in our last episode, fear to fascination, is not to be afraid of these things that are going to happen, but instead to engage with these ideas and be comfortable with them and not let them guide your everyday life, running from something that is inevitable, and instead becoming comfortable with this idea and allowing it to help define your life as opposed to being something that is not part of it, as something being separate from it.
Yeah.
That was one of the first things on my mind. But how about you, man? Where's your head at?
Well, so yesterday, my wife and I went back to the Miami Tattoo Company for part 2 of her tattoo. Very interesting. My wife decided just a couple of months ago that she wanted to get a tattoo that would cover her entire chest. She's never had a tattoo experience before, and as things with my wife Naomi goes, when she decides on something, she goes and she gets it. We went in, she had gotten this beautiful lotus and emerald composition right in the center of her chest, and that wasn't enough. We went back for part 2 yesterday, and she covered the rest of her breasts with outer space and galaxies and stars to create a beautiful backdrop for this lotus. And she was happy and singing through the whole thing. And when asked if she felt any pain, she said, "No, it tickles a little bit." But
I remember when I do not have any tattoos. I think I'm the only child of 11 children in my family that doesn't have a tattoo.
Wow.
But I really appreciate them on other people. But I remember giving her advice. I said, bring a flask.
Yeah, and she brought the flask with her for part 1.
Right.
And did not need it.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that she went through a mostly pleasurable tattoo experience.
Oh, she loved it.
I've heard some other ones. My brother got his first tattoo on his ribs, and it was a rather large piece. And my brother doesn't do anything in half measures, and he got a Francisco Goya painting.
Oh, my goodness.
The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. It has this woman sleeping over a desk, and on the side of the desk in Spanish it says, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." And out of her head are popping out all these bats and crazy things, kind of expanding. And he told me later that as the needle was going over his floating rib, his entire body was shaking, and it was the only time he had to stop in a 6-hour session.
Brother's hardcore, man.
Yeah. You know who else is hardcore?
Who else?
That student from New York. Did you hear about this? That shooting in New York?
Yeah, we heard about this, yes.
Well, I don't want to talk about the shooting, but I want to talk about the student who got injured and then showed up to school the next day. And when they asked him, "Why are you at school? Shouldn't you be home recovering?" He's like, "Yeah, but I was kind of working on perfect attendance, so I'm going to keep with that."
That's dedication right there.
Yeah, that's good on you, dude. Awesome. Good on you for your education.
That student from New York.
Yeah, that student from New York. He's getting a shout out here on Mindfulness of Doom.
And something else happened recently in the news. It's the 60-year anniversary of what now?
Oh, yeah, I was telling you about that. So today is the 60th anniversary of Laika, who is the Russian dog that was sent into outer space as one of their first experiments of sending. I think she became the first animal, the first living mammal to be in outer space. She's the first cosmonaut, and today was the 60th year anniversary of that. I thought it was appropriate to bring up a mindfulness of doom because the story is quite interesting. One, Laika was a stray, so they just picked her off the street, and she's just probably going, "Oh, I just want food. Oh, yay, people, lovely. Oh, I want to do this. This is great. Yay, yay, yay." And then suddenly, like, putting them in the capsule, and they're like, "No, I don't want to go in the space capsule. I love you. Feed me." And they send her up into space, and it's this beautiful thing, but they never intended for her to come back down. But the Russians told everybody that she was going to come back. But it wasn't until decades later that we found out that that was all propaganda.
Wow. So poor Laika was misled and has perfect reason to distrust humanity as a whole.
I mean, I think at a certain point, when you're doing science, animal testing is a big issue, and some animal testing has been extremely useful, and some of it has been just simply cruel and is unnecessary. But I think that sending an animal up into space, I know we send other stuff too.
We've sent chimpanzees. But normally the animals they're accompanied by human companions who will run the ship with the intention to come back.
Right.
But this was back in the 50s when they weren't so sure about sending human beings into space. So let's test this on Laika and see how she holds up. And it turns out that she didn't make it even past the first day. The spacecraft in which she was launched did not have sufficient insulation from the sun's radiation and was effectively cooked.
Well, she died. She didn't die of heat. It was a radiation poisoning, but it happened. She got 9 orbits around the Earth, which is less than they expected. They expected the test was basically to see if an animal could live for 10 days, but the spacecraft wasn't built properly, so she got a day.
Yeah, I'm just a mindful check-in right now. I'm checking in with my body, and I can feel the sadness welling up just beneath my rib cage and my solar plexus.
Yeah,
and it's starting to. Yes, it feels like a cold constricting that is making its way upward into my throat as we're talking about this, and I'm feeling my my empathy for Laika, the stray dog who was sent into outer space, never to intended to come back.
Yeah, it's a bit macabre, but I thought it was an interesting story to bring up because sometimes science leads us in places we didn't think we were going to go, and then other times it takes us exactly where we wanted to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good segue for us to bring our guests onto the show, and let's cut the small talk and bring them on.
Yeah, right on. We have with us in the studio Dr. Larry Goodman and his partner Martin Casado.
Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Yeah.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
Who are you and why are you awesome?
I'm Dr. Larry Goodman, and I've been in South Florida for more than half of my life. Don't ask me how that happened, but I've been here for 37 years. And
You're not originally from here?
No, I'm a little bit from New York, in case you couldn't tell.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
I find that people who are from here can't wait to leave, and people who move here can't escape.
Yes, my 26-year-old daughter lives in Seattle and has for the last 3 years. So yeah, that's quite accurate. Anyway, so I have training in chiropractic and nutrition and acupuncture and psychology. And what makes me awesome at this moment is the technique that I work with quite a bit is called Neuro Emotional Technique. And it's a mind-body stress management technique that lets us find blockages to people being present in the now and eliminate them rather quickly and effectively so that you're able to be more present in the now and achieve whatever it is you want to achieve.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Martin?
Yes. Well, I have a design company. I do graphic design and branding and websites and different things like that. And I guess I've been on a spiritual quest myself throughout the years, and I've read tons of books and so many things from Zen and Buddhism and a whole bunch of other things. And And I ended up meeting Larry through some barter and ended up seeing his NET techniques and seeing this and realized through all this reading and all these things that I've been doing, I needed a software update to understand the stuff that I was going through myself.
Yes.
So it was timing and divine intervention, I guess you could say. And I guess the awesomeness is realizing that we need upgrades. And in that upgrade, I've been a better designer. I've been a better person to myself, and spiritually growing. And yeah.
Is this a software upgrade or a hardware upgrade?
I think it's both. It would be both. And the hardware is more on the physical side, and the software, it's just what I'm feeding the mind.
Larry came to us through a mutual friend, actually somebody that I met by chance over at Miami-Dade College, and I was there for a concert that didn't actually happen, and it was one of those days where I feel like I'm in the right place, and even though nothing that I planned for the day is working out the way that I had intended. And I met a gentleman by the name of Andres Blanco, and instantly he and I became friends, and we started sharing just details about family and our lives and cultural influences on our behavior, which then evolved into a conversation about mindfulness and processing emotions, and then some of the work that I do over at Barry University with my students. And Andres had mentioned that he was going through some things that from a divorce from almost 2 decades ago that he was working on processing, and he said, I'm working with a doctor who does this Neuro Emotional Technique. His name is Larry Goodman, and you have to meet him. You absolutely must connect. And I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So here we are, and it was sort of a serendipitous happening that we got to connect here, and now you're here on the podcast. And we were discussing, before going on air, a lot of the merits of various healing modalities that you find in medicine and how effective they can be for certain people, how they leave us in terms of how we can be self-reliant in healing ourselves. And NET, as it is it sounds to me to be like a technique that you can use to get your stuff out of the way, so to speak, so that you can show up as your authentic self. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. That's really a good description of it. NET is a muscle testing, muscle balancing, biofeedback-based technique where we use the muscles of the body as an instrument to check and see what, if anything, is standing in the way of being present in the now. And so we start with an intact muscle. We say in NET, the acronym is hold your arm up, and when having a thought or an idea or a feeling or a statement, those things that we are congruent with, which means that they don't create stress on your nervous system, well, then the strong muscle stays strong. And when there are issues or items that we have sensitivity to, it creates a physiologic change, and the muscle will go from strong to weak. And we're then able to use that and follow this 15-step sequence to uncover and really, we'll say, eliminate the adverse response to the person, place, thing, idea, or event that you got sensitized to originally.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is that you're checking for conflicting belief systems within the subconscious mind, using muscles as a gauge for whether a person is aligned with what they really value or whether there's something that's misaligned and causing stress in the nervous system.
Yeah, that 18 inches between the head and the heart really turns out to be the longest 18 inches in the universe, you know. And so very often we say we want things, and we want to want things, or we say we want to do things, and we want to do things. And then the invisible rope around your arms stops you from taking the action, or as I kind of referred to earlier, the thing that you swore you'd never say to your kid when you were a kid. Yeah. Lo and behold, those very same words come out of your mouth talking to your kid, and you wind up puzzled within yourself as to, like, where did that come from?
It reminds me, one of my favorite images that I found on the internet, I made it my desktop background for years, was this cartoon image of a heart and a cartoon image of a brain, and the brain was just looking at the heart and said, I hate when you make me look stupid.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah. Dr. Goodman, how did you wind up on the path? Because you've been doing this for decades now, and I imagine you've had a lot of experiences. Like, where are you now, and how did you what passions drove you to get where you've gotten?
So I had my own life challenges around Hurricane Andrew time. There was this 90-day period of time. There's a children's book series called Series of Unfortunate Events, and that's really what happened. Was there was a series of unfortunate events that took place in and around Hurricane Andrew, and I was still in my traditional chiropractic practice at the time and was evidently somewhat distracted. And one of my patients one day said to me, "There's this woman you ought to go see at the University of Miami. She might be able to help you." And her name was Janet Kneffel, and she became my assistant dean at the university. And I had my first NET session with her. And though I was an applied kinesiology, muscle testing oriented chiropractor, the emotional side of the triangle was not something that I delved into quite a lot. And it was where she was able to go to right away. And it so fascinated me that the session with her was on a Tuesday, and the very next weekend they were having a seminar in Philadelphia, and I got on a plane and I went, and I haven't stopped studying it and working with it ever since.
That's awesome. Yeah, thinking about the emotions and how it relates to medicine, in the scientific community, emotions tend to be something that we can't really measure too well unless, of course, you're looking at brain scans and seeing how our neurology in the head responds to emotions. But it turns out that emotions can be felt and also stored in other parts of the body. Could you say a little bit about that?
We say in NET, the issues are in your tissues. That's
good.
Most everyone has had if you've had any sort of body work at all, you've had the experience of having some massage or deep tissue work, or we were discussing earlier, you had a bicycle accident, and many emotional issues got stored in the traumatized tissue of the body. And what you were mentioning about the brain scanning, the most exciting breakthrough right now has been this recently published study on NET using the stimulus of the stress of learning you have a cancer diagnosis.
Oh, goodness.
Which is about as highly stressful as it gets to be.
Talk about mindfulness of doom.
And what they did was they worked with this subject group, and they gave them 5 20-minute NET sessions. And before they gave them the sessions, they did a PET scan to read the stress reaction to the script of receiving the diagnosis of the cancer. And then they performed the NET protocol and repeated the test and found that the reduction in the stress reaction was off the charts, the greatest that had ever been measured in dealing with that.
Was this a study based on people who are actually receiving
These
their
were
cancer
These were
diagnosis?
actually patients who had received the diagnosis of cancer.
They had received it already prior.
They had already
to,
received it.
Okay.
No, we didn't take.
They
We didn't take normal, regular people.
By the way, what about cancer? What?
No. These were already existent subjects.
Did you get IRB approval for this study?
For sure. And you see, the point where it became so important and really is so valuable just in terms of the practice of healthcare is that in cancer therapy, one of the critical things to deal with is the immune system. And nothing depletes the effectiveness of the immune system quite like stress. And so, you get involved in this counter-cyclical, counter-logical cycle of we need to mobilize your immune system to fight the disease. Now we've identified the disease and we're about to let you know, and that's going to be about as devastating a thing as we can possibly do to your immune system.
Right.
So the NET protocol became a real tool to use to break that cycle. And we do quite a lot of that in the body part of using NET.
So let me ask you, you mentioned this traumatic news coming to these people. What is the purpose of using NET? In order to minimize their suffering or to help them move on into another thing? Or, is this like a one and done kind of thing? Or is this like an ongoing treatment?
It's really all of the above and open to the individual and very situationally determined. So, for instance, as I was referring to the body entry aspect of it, very effective in pain management. Sometimes when all of the physical work has been done to a tissue, and there's still remaining pain, NET becomes really useful in a pain management aspect to very often resolve the pain, which winds up being a totally fascinating thing from the perspective of the patient, because when you do the NET protocol, and you can check it out on netmindbody.com, that's the website. When you do the NET protocol in these cases, very often you don't even touch the involved part when you're doing the treatment. And so in this mind-body connection, there's probably no more fascinating disconnect between the involved part and a treatment than that. So, for instance, somebody has a shoulder problem, and they've already had the injection. They still have the pain. They've already had maybe even the arthroscopic surgery, and they still have the pain. And you go through this NET protocol where they put a finger on an acupuncture point on their wrist, a hand on their forehead, they close their eyes, they think, they breathe, and then in a few seconds the shoulder pain is gone. It's a fascinating thing to experience.
Yeah, and it's almost unbelievable. But if I think about it as a mindfulness practitioner, I'm aware of times when, let's say, before I really got into mindfulness, where I would hold emotional stress in certain parts of my body. If I was experiencing ongoing anxiety, I used to have this thing where I believed that I always had to be performing or doing something in order to be valued and productive in society, and so I wouldn't let myself rest. And I had this constant compression feeling in my chest, and it contributed to a lot of pain that I carried around with me. That eventually the emotional response from the anxiety would turn into a chronic pain that I would feel, and until I was able to actually go in with my attention and acknowledge the pain sensation and observe it and release it, that pain would be stuck there. So it was something that with practice I could do. It sounds like the NET process is similar in that we're bringing the patient's attention to the emotional component that's contributing to a pain. That one aspect could be a physical injury. For example, if I get hit by a car, as I did, there is, of course, the impact creates, broken cells and all sorts of things, and the neurology has to recover from the impact. But then on top of that, how much is my resentment of the driver and my remorse about, why did this happen to me? How much is that contributing to my physical pain? And it sounds like that's what NET can help me to release.
Yes, that's one of its absolute applications.
Yeah. My question is, so this is a technique for dealing with psychosomatic pains, or would this something be applicable? Like if you had just gotten injured, is this the kind of thing that you would use on a recent injury, or is this more like ongoing chronic injuries that start to come out?
So the interesting thing even about the question is that's a very Western medically languaged question, right, in terms of looking for what's the one solution to the one problem. Mm-hmm. And really the beautiful thing about the art of NET is we'll just call it the open-ended application of it, so that yes, you might deal with something immediate. Mm-hmm. There are other pieces of NET dealing with nutrition and acupuncture and homeopathy and things like that, but more staying on the mind side of the thing, there are also things related to what we would call post-traumatic stress disorders. Yes. But what they really deal with is moments in space-time where there was an incompletely processed emotion. Mm-hmm. Something happened, and the feeling associated with it. Something happened, and the emotion associated with it was something that you were unable to process, either because you didn't understand it, or you may have understood it on a conscious level, but it still had an unconscious component to it about which you may not even have been consciously aware. Freud talks about the repetition compulsion. And what we learned from doing NET over the years is that a lot of what drives the repetition compulsion is really the drive to re-experience the experience, because it creates what we call a facilitative neuronal pathway. Big words.
Big words, yes.
It's
break that down for us.
Think about, and I'll show my age here, a phonograph record that has a groove.
You're not that old.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. Anyway, and the phonograph record has a groove, and the needle that you put on the record wants to go to that groove because that's where the information is.
Yeah.
Well, what happens with your neurology is that when something in the now reminds your neurology of this earlier significant emotional event, your neurology wants to replay that because it's already in the groove, so to speak. And so what happens is we tend to do the same thing over and over again. Or
Creatures of habit.
Creatures of habit, yeah,
Right.
Exactly. And the habit, more often than you want to know, has an unconscious origin. And so you may know full well in your conscious mind that what you're about to say or do or not say or not do does not have your best interests at heart.
Right.
And yet you can't somehow keep from doing it.
Yeah. Brian and I often have discussions about my ability to hold my tongue. And sometimes coming into a situation where I'm going to be in a room with somebody that I may or may not disagree with, not necessarily this case, but I will try to vent those anxieties to Brian beforehand so I don't come out as a total jerk.
I shrink him for about an hour before we get into situations.
Yeah, because I harbor a healthy academic skepticism of nearly as much as I can. I tussle with the ability to listen and to understand and to have an empty cup and to be able to learn something new at the same time as filtering out the message from the words used to deliver the message. Because I used to be an English teacher, and I understand that the way we communicate, the message I intend to send, the words that come out of my mouth, the words that you think that I have said, and then the message that you interpret from those words, all are different parts of the process, and sometimes they get misconstrued along the way. So I'm always very conscious of that. You mentioned that sometimes people have these things they're unaware of them. And then when you bring them up, they've already healed from the injury, but they still have something in their body blocking the full healing. So does it get better, or does it sometimes get worse before it gets better?
It almost always gets better. The moment of awareness is sometimes, we'll call it surprising, maybe a little bit distressing. One of my first NET clients ever, when I first started to do this work, was a gentleman who was held up at gunpoint in Puerto Rico many years ago. And he was a very macho Latin gentleman, and he had insisted to his wife and daughter that he was well over that when he'd been held up more than once. But he was well over it because, he was over it because he said so. And so his wife was quite certain that he was not over it because of things that would occur in his attitude and demeanor, that it was clear to her that he was not quite the same as he had been. And so she suggested that he come to see me, and he came to see me, and he was telling me about the incident. And in NET, we have these things that are called personal declaratives. It's just making a simple statement. And so the simple statement that I had him make with holding his arm up was, I'm okay with being held up at gunpoint. And he turned ashen gray, started to sweat, his knees buckled, and he fell down into the chair. And I looked at him and I said, well. And he looked at me and started to chuckle because we always laugh at our tragedies. And he said, I guess I'm not so okay after all.
Yeah.
And so we were able to work with it, but first there had to be the awareness that it was a sensitizing event. And that's often what happens is when we start to work with people, I say that the conscious mind's veneer is sometimes paper thin. And when you make a self-referring statement where there is some emotional charge to it, it's rather astonishing how close that emotional charge is to being brought up to the surface. And so by using the rest of the tools of NET to really get to the heart of the snapshot of the event, when the language is just right, that's exactly the way that the body-mind memory bank has it stored,
Yeah.
the emotion's right there. One of my clients the other day said, boy, you ought to have stock in Kleenex, because boy, do you use a lot of tissues here.
Yeah.
That actually really resonates with me. When I was in grad school, I almost dropped out. I was a semester away from finishing, and I wasn't doing my homework. I wasn't studying, and I was going to class, and I really enjoyed classes, but for some reason I was done. I loved every bit of it, but I wasn't doing the work that I needed to do, and I couldn't figure out why. And I started going to the counseling and psychological services, which was extremely helpful, just to talk to somebody about it. And I went through my first therapy session, and I said to the therapist, like, look, I know you're not here to fix me. You're here to help me fix me. Let's talk this out and work it out. And I understand that this is a process. I understand that it takes time, but what's your first impressions? Where do you think we should go from here? Any books you think I should read? And he goes, well, I think it's pretty obvious you have adult attention deficit disorder. And I was like, huh? and he's like, and basically all the words that I had said to him had really pointed to this thing that I did not know that I had. And then I read a few books, and then I read a few more, and then I watched a very good 3-hour lecture by Dr. Russell Barclay, who's like one of the leading ADHD researchers in the world, and it blew my mind. I didn't even realize that it was something that I could have had, because my understanding of it at the time was the same thing that everybody who watches the news gets it from, and they just don't understand the complexities and the it's called the wrong thing, and so that's a major problem with it. And so people think it's a problem with attention, and it's not. It's a problem with intention, and to be able to do these things. So when I started going through the process of therapy, I got really excited, started reading some books, and started to feel really good about myself, and then crashed hard when I realized how much of a burden I had been carrying and did not know I was carrying. And I called my mom one day, and I'm on campus. It's the middle of the day. I sit down on a bench, and I call her up just to talk about it, and just kind of like, I felt good coming out of a therapy session, and then it just crashed on me at the end, and I was just like crying in the middle of campus, like talking to my mom, just like trying to describe the immensity of what it was, of uncovering this thing that I had been dealing with, and realizing that I didn't just need medication, which it helped, but that's only part of it. I also needed to be educated on it. I also needed the therapy, and I also needed to modify my life and how I was, my behaviors were assisting the things that were holding me back, and just coming to terms with all of that and realizing how much work I had to go. It definitely got worse before it got better.
It can. The other thing about these triggers, we're now just about past the effects of Hurricane Irma. And many people, in fact, I worked with quite a few people who Hurricane Irma re-stimulated their memories of Hurricane Andrew. And though it had been many, many years since Andrew, the parallels in terms of the imagery and in terms of the destructiveness to people's homes and property many people who really had not had that particular tissue memory re-stimulated in a while, it started to show up again. And so you asked earlier about if things were one and done. Sometimes they are, but more often than not, the logo on the homeopathic remedies that we use in NET have an artichoke on them. And the artichoke is very much a metaphor for the way the body-mind works, where you peel off a layer, a leaf, and then you peel off another layer, a leaf. And when you get down to the core, there's the heart of the artichoke. And so we find in NET that as you peel away the layer upon layer, what's left underneath it all is the pure heart of the loving soul of the person. And that, unfortunately, who shows up, I won't say the rest of the time, but
I will.
a lot of the time is your evil twin.
Right.
And your evil twin is only showing up because something in the now reminded your neurology of some other time when you felt threatened or in danger or something of that nature.
To give you an example of myself being a client and not even understanding therapy, I was kind of going into a business approach and not even understanding NET when we first started. We were kind of bartering to do his branding and a website and stuff like that, do what I do, and then he was going to do what Larry does, Yeah. And to get to that process, I didn't even, you don't get NET right away. You have to find the source of our problem. You just don't come in right. In your case, you got lucky in the AHC. Hey, you're all over the place. I'm going to diagnose you here.
It was a pretty simple diagnosis. Right. Looking back and realizing, like, I had said all the key trigger words to point to it, right. And I didn't know that I was saying them until I did the research.
Exactly. Well, and then my thing was, I already went in going in the artist business side, and my stuff, I was just, I was losing all these clients, doing all these things, and it was just I met Larry in this perfect timing in my life, and then when it did get to the point of NET, and because I had a common friend that introduced us, Angela, and she was like, have you got NET yet? Have you got your arm up? I'm like, no, I've just been like 3 or 4 sessions in. I haven't even touched that. I'm like, am I supposed to? Am I supposed to ask him for that? So it's like a thing of like, all of a sudden when he found the source, we found this thing, and it's something that I can talk about so I guess easily now because we came to terms, and I had a lot of father issues, father things and stuff like that, and he found something when I was like 7, and one intense one, if to stay on point on one that you were asking about, like, is there an automatic healing or we were calling it an epiphanito that we'll get to, that it was more of a fact of in the purging, we got to a certain point, we it to a part where it was a father thing. He narrowed it down that I was it was a certain part. I didn't want to fail in my business, and I tried so hard, and I kept failing. I kept losing my clients. The more I tried, the harder, and it's like I'm doomed, and blah blah blah. And he's put your arm up. I want you. When was this? And he got down to I was 17, and then all of a sudden it was like I was supposed to choose between going to school. I wanted to study graphic design, and my father said, you're going to study finance, and that's what you're going to do. We have a family company. You're taking this over. I was like, your whole destiny's set. Take it, and this is how it is. Machismo thing. And so I got to this thing, and all of a sudden it was related, and he's like, well, put your arm up, and something in my arm started sweating, and all my arms, and I just started crying, like just nonstop crying, and I couldn't control my. Is this a thing? Like, what am I doing right? You didn't even do the, and before I even got to the
I didn't
thing,
know I had a cry button. I'm looking at my arm.
Yeah, and he whipped out the tissues. He's like, here's the thing. He's like, protocol of the tissues. And it came down to a source that I let go of that decision, that neurological part of my life, and that I was in that groove, and it was pertaining to every time I was going to make a decision. I felt like it was like a fatherly thing. But when it came to terms, it all came to something in my own life, and then the next couple of days, it was something that I cried it out. We came to terms. He had his techniques afterwards, and I cleared it out in a sense because I can talk about it openly here and saying how it felt and how it's just things keep moving forward. That groove is no longer playing. Right. So the point of it, after days after, I'd cry sometimes by myself or this, and then I get tired. I was sleepy on this, and the same one Angela told me, like, you went through a lot. Your body needs to recover. It needs to rest, and it was true. I wanted to keep hustling. I wanted to keep working. I wanted to see what I could. And then when I rested and I surrendered in a sense, and everything started coming better. I needed that update that I was telling you. I didn't recognize that I needed the update because you kind of deleted something that was part of your story, you know. So
in mindfulness, when I'm teaching my students, one of the things that I'll often use as a framing device for them to think about the things that we're learning is I'll remind them that, you know, I'll ask them to consider their name and say, you know, who do you think you are? And now, who do you think you were 5 years ago? And who do you think you were 20 years ago? And then throughout that process of coming to the realization that those people are different people. They exist in one direction of time, but they are a constantly redefined person. And the person you are now is not the same person who walked in the door. Your set of experiences, your feelings, your emotions, the things that are happening to you now are unique to your situation now. And that person in 5 seconds is going to be gone. And the way to use this in mindfulness as a beneficial tool is to remind yourself that you don't have to hang on to who you think you were. And understanding that you are not a noun, you are a verb. You're not a thing that constantly holds its shape, the thing that constantly holds its character and its influences. Those things change over time. Your memories are something that happen in the present, and they change over time. And understanding that you are a process, understanding that you are not something that is definitive at any one point, and you're constantly changing. So what I tell my students is, don't come to mindfulness to find yourself, because you're not going to find it. Come to mindfulness to redefine yourself, because a lot of our pains and sufferings come from this idea that who I think I am and who I am have become separated, and I'm suffering because the person that I actually am is a person that I have a preference that person is a terrible person. You know, you beat yourself up and you think, I should be like this, I should be like this, I want to be like this, I want to be how my dad said I should be, you know, I want to impress everybody. And then you spend some time looking inside and understanding that what you think you are and who you actually are different things. And then when you redefine, you get a chance to update that definition. And over time, that definition will change again. And so as long as you are periodically redefining yourself, not finding, but redefining, and you end up finding yourself on the path more and more often, as opposed to finding yourself off of the path more and more often.
Yeah, it's funny you said it's something I realized like not too long ago when I was younger. It's like, man, you haven't seen an old friend in a long time, right? And they're like, man, you haven't changed. You're awesome, man. You haven't changed. You're so funny still. Whatever character I was at that time.
It's kind of a letdown when you hear that.
That's my point. Now in like the last 2 years, that's an insult to me. Now it's kind of like I want to be like, man. Now my friends are like, oh, remember the old Martin, or remember the old this, and that's like I'm glad they reckon I'm working. It's not that I'm working hard. I've changed. We phase. We go into phases, and what you're talking about is that. So that thing of saying that if somebody tells me now, hey, you're just the same as you were 10 years ago, I'll be like, that's an insult.
Or it's a lack of observation that they haven't seen the growth. It's kind of like going back and visiting your parents for Christmas, and like they know all of the all of the stories. They remember when you were naked and climbed over the fence when you were 4 to go visit the neighbor. They remember when you.
That was a thing you did?
That was a thing my brother did.
Oh, okay. Good catch.
I'm not going to out myself here.
What were you doing naked as a child?
I was chasing the garbage men.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, because I would always wave at them when they came down the street, and then one day I overslept, and I heard the truck going away. So I ran outside, got on my tricycle, and chased them down the street. And then my mother, I was between 2 and 4. I don't know exactly how old I was, but my mother was in the shower. She ran out after me, like half naked with a towel wrapped around her, and the garbage men are laughing so hard they fell off the back of the truck because I was just chasing after them, just trying to say hi.
Yes.
So, okay. Anecdotes.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that all it took to access that memory was this particular conversation.
And a mind that it's easily distracted.
Well, and aren't we all? And aren't we all to an enormous extent? as you were telling the story, I was reminded of a patient that I worked with many years ago who was a flight attendant who had gotten injured on a flight. And she had only been able to get so much better, returned to work, was only able to get so much better. And it turned out that the trigger to the memory of the injury was the blazer of her uniform. Wow. And so what we literally did was, don't ask me all the detective work that we had to do to discover that. Yeah. But because her life experience was being particularly puzzling, because she'd say, I feel fine when I'm home. And I go to work and my back starts to hurt again. And I like my job and I don't understand. In fact, you know what? It's not even just when I go to work. I start getting dressed to go to work and my back starts to hurt again. And so lo and behold, we were able to, the trigger was literally the jacket. And so we were able to discern that, and then using NET, break the connection of the tissue memory of the jacket that she was wearing when she injured herself. And then she was able to wear the jacket, and there was no more pain.
So it was the right words, the right language, the right images brought this up. I think finally when things are presented to me with the right language, and in the right way, I'm able to absorb them much easier. And then when they're presented to me in a gimmicky way, I resist so strongly. And I've realized that once I started studying mindfulness, I realized that the messages that I was receiving from people weren't the messages they were intending to send. And I'm trying to listen through those parts of me that resist so hard, because I'm like, oh, that's not real science, or oh, that's there's a nuance there that isn't being.
Mother, father, sister, brother, teacher, preacher, whatever the memories are of those powerful figures. Sometimes it's intonation. Sometimes it's the sequence of the words. Sometimes it's just a particular tone of voice. Sometimes it's whatever it is. At any given moment, there are many layers of things going on at the same time. And what any of us is responding to at that particular moment may or may not be what you think it is.
Right. And it brings up, we get triggered by whatever that intonation is or that combination of words is, and what goes up automatically is a filter through which we view life. Or,
exactly.
or in other words, a personality comes to the rescue to keep us safe, and we start to be a certain way. And I love the parallels between both of the techniques of NET and mindfulness. They're very much rooted in using our awareness to break through. Oh, I didn't know that was a thing.
Right.
Now that I'm aware of it, how can we really go in, feel it, process it fully, and let it go? And it turns out that all of the personality coping mechanisms and the filters that we're now coloring our reality start to melt away in that moment. And what was the word?
Epifanito.
The epifanito, which is in Espanol, or rather in broken Spanglish, a very small epiphany. It's not something that is like, wow, my whole life is different now all of a sudden, and I can see things clearly. It's more of like, oh,
it's
well,
like when you're wearing like a yellow shirt and you're in a certain kind of lighting, and then you walk outside and you realize your shirt's orange. And you're like, oh, epiphany.
Right. It's like, wow, that's so interesting. I can get where I was now, and that, wow, you sort of you're dumbfounded.
There's
for a
no
moment.
fireworks. There's like in the movies with the cue the music. Right. It's a silent beauty. I guess it's something like, wow, I don't have to.
So there's this in Buddhism. There's a big argument between the Theravada Buddhists and the Mahayana Buddhists. And the Theravada Buddhists is the southern traditions of Thailand and India and Sri Lanka. And they believe that enlightenment is a gradual thing, and it's a thing that you have to dedicate your life to, and it comes slowly. And then you go and study the Mahayanists, and they're like, nope, you don't have to be a monk. It could be sudden. It could take 30 years, or it could take 3 seconds. And so there's this back and forth argument of like a sudden enlightenment versus a gradual enlightenment.
Well, this is like, do I want to peel back the layers of the artichoke slowly, or do I just want to eat the whole thing?
Well, in Buddhism, you wouldn't want to do that because they don't use artichokes; they use onions.
Oh, that's not a good idea.
Well, and
You
the
want to peel
point,
back the layers, but you don't want to bite straight into it.
and the point of the question you asked about it being a one and done thing or an ongoing process, it really is a question of what the goal and the objective of the client is.
Right.
You know, I'm going to be working with a young lady tomorrow who has been a client of mine over the years for 20 years. And as her life has evolved and changed and evolved and changed, based on what's going on in her life, she'll work with me on what's going on of the challenges of the moment, because she's become enlightened within her own mindfulness that there's something in the way of my achieving what it is I'm setting out to achieve. And I'd really like to work with it so that it can either go away or at least recede into the background. You know, meditation I find is one of the most interesting things in Western culture as to how it is misunderstood and misinterpreted, because my experience is that many people don't meditate more because they have a misunderstanding of what's supposed to happen. And they say, well, I can't quiet my mind. And the answer I give is, well, of course not. You're not supposed to be able to quiet your mind. Yeah. The design function of the mind is to think. Yeah. Of course you're going to think. The object of
I'm trying to quiet my heart for a moment. I mean, it's just I can't get it to stop beating.
Yeah, this breathing, it's getting in the way. I just need to stop it.
God, it takes up so much of my day.
I don't see pretty colors. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be a trip.
No mystical experiences.
I think you're right on that, because when I teach, my meditation classes, when I teach the intro class, the very first thing I tell people is like, look, this is not going to give you superpowers. It is applicable to everything in your life, but it's not going to give you the benefits if you come into it seeking those benefits. What you think you're doing and what you're actually doing happen to be different things. And let's get some, so clear the board of the misconceptions about meditation. And I think that it's really important for people to practice this thing of, you're not quieting the mind so much as you are practicing focusing. I was thinking earlier, I was actually meditating with Brian earlier today, and in one of those moments where my mind was not being quiet, I thought of a new definition for meditation. Meditation is a focusing, in the sense that you are taking your mind and putting it on an object when you're doing object meditation, and if it's a flow-stated meditation, then meditation is a flowing, or an experiencing. It's a concentrated, intentional experience with the mind, where you place it on something and you intend to be with that experience regardless of how it feels, not making judgments about it, but just being aware of it. And in doing so, that focusing narrows your focus as if it was like a flashlight that you turned the nozzle on and hyper-focused on something. It decreases the peripheral surface area, and the amount of distractions that come up tend to be lessened because you have a smaller focus, less things to come up on the periphery. And I find that once you do that, once you are able to focus on something, you find a peacefulness. You find a relaxing of the mind because of the focus. But if you go in trying to quiet the mind, it's the opposite. You're harming yourself as opposed to helping yourself in that goal of being quiet-minded. The good example is like if you've got a tub of water or a lake in front of you and it's a little bit choppy and you want the water to smooth out and you try to smooth it out with your hands.
Yeah, the flat iron.
Yeah, you only make more ripples.
Yeah. Quite true.
So we're coming to the end of our episode, but before we complete, you guys are working on a book together, are you not? Would you like to take a moment?
Yeah, tell us about the book.
Tell us about your book and your website and where we can find you.
The story, basically it's called Fridays with Goodman. When we started our sessions, I started at 9 a.m. on Friday, and I picked that so I can wake up early on Friday mornings. Because as a graphic designer, at my best works, I start at 11 p.m. and sometimes I had to put like a cap of like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. And so I did Friday 9 a.m. on purpose so I can wake up early, get over to, I was in Midtown at the time too, Coral Gables, and that's how it started. And it's just a journey of an artist, graphic designer that meets this guy with all this wisdom and all this these things that I didn't know about. He made me find, how would you say it? He projected out
The best way I can describe it is that the company evolved a name, and it's called the Goodman Factor. Not just the play on words of my last name, but because I've come to observe both about myself and about working with lots of people that there is an inner good man, or we'll be politically correct and say, or good woman, yes, in each of us that wants to come out.
You ever thought about changing your name to Good Person?
It's something.
The PC police are here even today.
It's like, well, how do we make this gender neutral?
Yeah, gender neutral.
Yes.
Right? So anyway, the point is you can go to thegoodmanfactor.com, and I'm there. Or
the book is also in the editing process.
The book is being edited,
out, and we are on the process of that. So yeah, it's just you'll learn all these things in my own life that happened, and how our relationship made the Goodman Factor, and many factors of life that I learned. And and you can find the rest of the things on thegoodmanfactor.com. And
so we have workshops and one-on-one sessions, and I'll go work with companies where there's stuff getting in the way. It's really very free-form and adaptable depending on the wants and needs of the person or the company.
Got it. Do you want to plug your website, Martin?
Yes, you can also get mine at it's nitramdesign.com. NITRAM is Martin backwards, so Martin nitramdesign.com. You can see all the work I've done there, and branding, websites, all the way to social media. I make it happen.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. We appreciate having you guys here.
Thank you for having us. It was fun. It's great.
Good stuff.
This episode of Mindfulness of Doom brought to you by the phrase, get over it. It turns out it's a lot more complicated than we've been told.
And also this week we're sponsored by our real fake sponsors, Russian Stray Dogs. Russian Stray Dogs, supporting the podcast since the 1950s. Thankful that they weren't chosen to go to space.
This episode of Mindfulness of Doom has been sponsored by the phrase epiphanitos, which are tiny reminders of the reality of your existence.
Yes, and our final sponsor today is the Perfect Attendance. Yes, perfect attendance in the face of terrorism. Give the finger to terrorism. Go to school. That guy is awesome.
That takes commitment.
Thank you for listening to Mindfulness of Doom. You can find our podcast at Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Stitcher,
and TuneIn,
SoundCloud,
and all places where podcasts of all quality can be found.
Except Spotify. We're still working on that one.
Yep. And if you find this episode and our prior episodes to be valuable for you in your life, we are now on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/mindfulnessofdoom and become a patron of our podcast. You can give as little as $1 a month to help keep our podcast going and supporting listeners like you.
Yes, we've actually put a video up there for you to check out. You can actually watch Brian and me fumble our way through asking for money to help us out, support the show.
Making complete asses of ourselves for the purposes of requesting your small contributions to help us drink coffee frequently.
Yes, that's at this point, that is our goal. Our first stretch goal is to have anyone buy us coffee.
Very good. This episode brought to you by shameless self-promotion. It's that thing that makes you really uncomfortable, but you know you need to do it because you need to earn a living. We invite you to like, subscribe, and rate our podcast on iTunes and wherever podcasts of real quality can be found. Have suggestions, music, or artwork for the show? Want to sponsor our podcast? Find our contact page and links to the items we talked about in this episode at www.mindfulnessofdoom.com.
This podcast is recorded at the Center for Social Change in Miami, Florida. It is written, edited, and recorded by Brian Lemmerman and Corey Hardacre. Our music is by Pallet Town and can be found at soundcloud.com/PalletTown. All poorly thought out opinions are ours. Nothing you hear in this podcast should be construed as professional medical advice. Go see a therapist, all of you.
When I start working with a client, the first question is always, what do you want? And the second question is, and what are you willing to do to get there?
Yeah.
And you know, that's kind of the thing.
Yeah. I see the parallels between what we're each doing here is that, like, it takes work, and we have to be willing to put it in to get the results. It's not like a magic solution.
Or you take an opioid.
Right.